My son Bradley sat in the front pew of Harmony Methodist Church checking his phone during his own mother's eulogy. When the pastor finished speaking about Margaret's 43 years of dedication to our community, Bradley leaned over and whispered loud enough for half the congregation to hear, "This is incredibly boring, Dad. Can we wrap this up? I have a conference call at 4." The shocked gasps from the mourners still echo in my mind. But what Bradley didn't know was that in exactly 2 hours he would discover just how much his mother had been paying attention to his behavior all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started with the familiar ritual I'd performed every day since Margaret passed 3 weeks ago. I stood in the narrow kitchen of my Riverside Gardens apartment, staring at the single-serve coffee maker that had replaced our old percolator. Everything in my life had become smaller since moving here after Margaret's death. Smaller living space, smaller portions, smaller expectations. At 68, I was learning to live in the diminished world that widowhood creates, where every appliance, every meal, every decision served as a reminder that the person who gave life meaning was gone. The apartment complex buzzed with the gentle activity of other seniors navigating their own versions of loss and adaptation. Through my kitchen window, I could see Harold Peterson walking his ancient beagle along the well-maintained pathways between buildings. Across the courtyard, Eleanor Walsh tended to her small balcony garden with the careful attention of someone who had learned to find purpose in whatever space remained available to her. These people had become my neighbors by necessity rather than choice, but their quiet dignity in the face of life's inevitable reductions gave me a strange comfort. Margaret would have hated this place. Not because it wasn't nice. Riverside Gardens was actually quite pleasant, with its community center, library, and weekly social activities, but because it represented the kind of settling that went against everything she believed about life. "Frank Thompson," she used to say, when I'd suggest we should start thinking about downsizing, "the day I move to a place where they organize my social calendar is the day you'll know I've given up." But here I was, surrounded by scheduled bingo nights and group exercise classes because the house on Maple Avenue was too full of memories and too expensive to maintain on my school pension alone. The funeral preparations had consumed the past week, transforming my quiet grief into a series of logistical challenges that Margaret would have handled with her characteristic efficiency. She had been the organizer in our marriage, the one who kept track of birthdays, anniversaries, family obligations, and social connections. Without her, I found myself fumbling through decisions about flowers, catering, guest lists, and memorial service details. The funeral director at Harmony Memorial had been patient with my confusion, gently guiding me through choices that seemed simultaneously important and meaningless. Bradley had arrived from Des Moines the night before, sweeping into my apartment with the restless energy of someone accustomed to controlling his environment. At 35, he had inherited Margaret's drive and organizational skills, but without her warmth or community connection. He carried himself with the confident bearing of a successful real estate developer, his expensive suit and luxury watch announcing his achievements to anyone who cared to notice. He had immediately taken over the funeral arrangements, making phone calls to adjust the timing, critiquing the flower choices, and suggesting changes to the reception menu. "Dad, you can't serve church basement food to Mom's business associates," he had announced, scrolling through his phone while I attempted to make dinner. "These people are used to a certain standard. Mom's reputation is still important, even after she's gone." He had called the caterer directly, upgrading the reception to include items that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When I suggested that Margaret would have preferred something simpler, something that reflected the down-to-earth values she had maintained even as her business grew, Bradley had given me the same patronizing look he'd been perfecting since high school. Dad, you mean well, but you don't understand the business world Mom operated in. These relationships matter. The way we handle this funeral will be remembered. He had spoken with the assured authority of someone who believed that his success in real estate development translated to expertise in all areas of life. What Bradley never seemed to grasp was that his mother's success hadn't come from impressing people with expensive displays, but from genuine care for her customers and community. Margaret had started Maggie's Kitchen from our dining room table in 1982, preparing simple, wholesome meals for busy families who wanted home-cooked food without the time to prepare themselves. I remembered those early days when our house constantly smelled of roasting chickens, fresh bread, and simmering soups. Margaret would spend her mornings shopping for the freshest ingredients, her afternoons cooking with the precision of someone who understood that food was an expression of love, and her evenings delivering meals to grateful customers who had become like extended family. The business had grown slowly, organically, driven by word-of-mouth recommendations and Margaret's unwavering commitment to quality. She never advertised in newspapers or hired marketing consultants. Instead, she built her reputation one satisfied customer at a time, remembering their preferences, accommodating their dietary restrictions, and treating their celebrations and sorrows as her own. When Mrs. Patterson's husband died, Margaret had provided food for the wake without charge. When the Hendersons welcomed their first grandchild, she had prepared a month's worth of meals for the new parents. This was how Margaret understood business, as an extension of community care rather than profit maximization. By the time Bradley graduated from college, Maggie's Kitchen employed 15 people and served customers throughout 3 Iowa counties. Margaret had moved operations to a commercial kitchen space downtown, but she maintained the personal touch that had built her reputation. She knew the names of her employees' children, attended their weddings and graduations, and treated her staff more like family than hired help. The business thrived because Margaret never forgot that success meant serving others, not accumulating wealth for its own sake. Bradley had different ideas about what success should look like. After college, he had briefly worked for his mother's company, but his suggestions for expansion, automation, and efficiency improvements had clashed with Margaret's more personal approach to business. He wanted to franchise the operation, hire cheaper labor, and focus on profit margins rather than community relationships. When Margaret resisted these changes, Bradley had announced his decision to pursue real estate development in Des Moines, where his talents would be properly appreciated. The conversation that ended Bradley's involvement with Maggie's Kitchen had taken place at our dining room table on a rainy Sunday in October. Margaret had prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables from her garden, hoping to smooth over the growing tension between her business philosophy and his ambitions. Instead, the dinner had become a battleground for competing visions of what work should mean. "Mom, you're thinking too small," Bradley had argued, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. "You've built something valuable here, but you're not maximizing its potential. We could have locations across the Midwest within 5 years if you just listened to reason." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret had sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the expression she adopted when she was marshaling her thoughts for a difficult conversation. "Bradley, honey, I didn't build this business to create an empire. I built it to serve people in our community, to provide good food and steady employment for folks who depend on me. Growth for the sake of growth isn't success. It's just greed dressed up in fancy clothes." Her words had hung in the air like smoke, and I had watched my son's face cycle through surprise, frustration, and finally dismissal. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people stuck in small towns with small dreams," he had replied, his voice taking on the edge that appeared whenever his authority was questioned. "You could be wealthy, really wealthy, instead of just comfortable. You could build something that lasts, something that matters on a larger scale."
Margaret had reached across the table to touch his hand, but he had pulled away. "What I've built does matter, son, just not in the way you're measuring it." That had been the end of Bradley's involvement with Maggie's kitchen, and the beginning of a distance between him and Margaret that never fully healed. He moved to Des Moines, found success developing commercial properties, and visited Cedar Falls only on holidays and obligatory occasions. His phone calls became brief, focused on logistics rather than connection, and his conversations with Margaret grew increasingly superficial. Now, standing in my small apartment kitchen on the morning of Margaret's funeral, I realized how thoroughly Bradley had disconnected himself from the life his mother had built. He saw her business as quaint, her values as limiting, and her community connections as provincial. What he failed to understand was that Margaret had been building something far more valuable than wealth. She had been creating a legacy of generosity, integrity, and service that had touched hundreds of lives in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. The irony was that Maggie's kitchen had indeed become quite valuable by the time of Margaret's death. Her commitment to quality and community had created a business worth far more than Bradley realized. But the true measure of her success wasn't in the financial statements. It was in the dozens of employees whose families she had supported, the thousands of customers whose lives she had nourished, and the community that had been strengthened by her presence. This was the legacy that Bradley was about to discover he had misunderstood completely. The sanctuary of Harmony Methodist Church had never felt more foreign to me than it did that Tuesday morning. I arrived 30 minutes early, hoping to find a quiet moment to collect myself before facing the crowd of mourners who had gathered to honor Margaret's memory. The church where we had been married 45 years ago, where Bradley had been baptized as an infant, where Margaret had sung in the choir every Sunday until her illness made it impossible, now seemed like a stage set for a performance I wasn't prepared to give. Pastor Williams greeted me at the side entrance with the gentle efficiency of someone who had shepherded countless families through their darkest hours. He led me to a small room behind the altar where I could wait privately until the service began. Through the thin walls, I could hear the gradual arrival of mourners, their hushed conversations creating a low murmur that grew steadily louder as more people entered the sanctuary. Margaret would have been amazed by the turnout. Even I was surprised by how many lives she had touched during her 72 years in Cedar Falls. Bradley arrived fashionably late, as had become his custom for family gatherings. I watched through the small window as he stepped out of his black BMW sedan, adjusting his designer suit jacket and checking his phone one final time before putting on what I recognized as his public face. He moved through the church entrance with the confident stride of someone accustomed to making an impression, nodding at acquaintances and shaking hands with business associates who had made the drive from Des Moines to pay their respects. The service began with Pastor Williams reading from Ecclesiastes, the familiar passage about seasons and times that Margaret had requested in her final weeks. She had been very specific about her funeral arrangements, writing detailed instructions that reflected her practical nature and her desire to keep things simple and meaningful. She wanted hymns that the congregation could sing together rather than elaborate musical performances. She wanted flowers from local gardens rather than expensive floral arrangements. She wanted the reception to feature food from Maggie's kitchen, prepared by her own staff as a final gift to the community that had supported her business for 40 years. The first speaker was Dorothy Chen, Margaret's longest-serving employee and the woman who had helped transform Maggie's kitchen from a one-person operation into a thriving business. Dorothy had worked alongside Margaret for 38 years, starting as a part-time assistant when her children were small and eventually becoming the kitchen manager who oversaw daily operations. She spoke about Margaret's kindness during her divorce, when Margaret had quietly increased her hours and responsibilities to help her support her family as a single mother. Margaret Thompson never saw employees as expenses to be minimized, Dorothy said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. She saw us as family members to be supported and encouraged. When my daughter needed surgery we couldn't afford, Margaret arranged for the company to cover the medical bills. When my son graduated high school and wanted to attend college, she created a scholarship program that helped dozens of local students pursue their education.
That's the kind of woman we're honoring today. I glanced at Bradley during Dorothy's remarks and noticed him checking his phone discreetly, apparently more interested in his business messages than in hearing about his mother's generosity. When Dorothy finished speaking, several other employees and community members shared similar stories about Margaret's quiet acts of kindness and support. Each testimony painted a picture of a woman who had used her success to lift up others rather than elevate herself. Mrs. Patterson, now 93 and walking with a cane, spoke about the meals Margaret had delivered personally during her husband's final illness. "She never just dropped off the food and left," Mrs. Patterson recalled, her voice trembling with emotion. "She would sit with us for a few minutes, ask about Harold's pain levels, and listen when I needed to talk about how scared I was. She made the hardest time of my life a little more bearable through her presence and her caring." Tom Rodriguez, who had started working at Maggie's Kitchen as a teenager and was now the head chef, described how Margaret had encouraged his culinary ambitions and paid for him to attend cooking school in Chicago. "She believed in me before I believed in myself," he said. "She saw potential where others saw just another kid from the wrong side of town. Everything I've accomplished, every skill I've developed, started with Mrs. Thompson giving me a chance and then supporting me as I grew." The testimonies continued for nearly an hour, each one revealing another dimension of Margaret's impact on the community. I had known about some of her charitable activities, but many of these stories were new to me. Margaret had always been modest about her generosity, treating her acts of kindness as private matters rather than public relations opportunities. Listening to these accounts, I realized that she had been running a quiet welfare system alongside her catering business, using her profits to address needs that she noticed in the lives of people around her. Bradley's restlessness became more obvious as the service continued. He shifted in his seat, checked his watch repeatedly, and made little effort to hide his impatience with the length of the testimonies. When Pastor Williams invited anyone else who wanted to share memories to come forward, Bradley audibly sighed and muttered something under his breath that made the people sitting near him turn their heads in surprise. The final speaker was Janet Sullivan, president of the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce and someone who had worked with Margaret on numerous community development projects. She spoke about Margaret's role in revitalizing downtown Cedar Falls, her support for other small businesses, and her leadership in creating programs that helped entrepreneurs get started in the community. Margaret Thompson understood that a successful business has responsibilities beyond profit, Janet said, looking directly at Bradley as she spoke. She knew that prosperity means nothing if it doesn't lift up the entire community. Her legacy isn't just Maggie's Kitchen, though that business has been a cornerstone of our local economy for 4 decades. Her legacy is the dozens of families she employed, the hundreds of entrepreneurs she mentored, and the thousands of people she fed not just with food, but with hope and dignity. When Janet finished speaking, Pastor Williams offered a closing prayer and invited everyone to join us for a reception in the church fellowship hall. As the congregation began to file out of the sanctuary, I noticed Bradley immediately pulling out his phone and stepping aside to take a call. I could hear fragments of his conversation as people walked past him toward the reception. "Yes, I know the timing isn't ideal, but we need to move quickly on the Henderson property," he was saying, his voice carrying the urgent tone he used for business matters. "Can you push the closing to Thursday? I should be back in Des Moines by then." He was scheduling real estate deals while standing in the sanctuary where his mother's funeral had just concluded, apparently unaffected by the testimonies about her generosity and community impact. The reception in the fellowship hall was exactly what Margaret would have wanted. Her staff from Maggie's Kitchen had prepared a spread of her most popular dishes, served on the church's mismatched plates, and accompanied by coffee from the large percolators that had been brewing church coffee for decades. The food was delicious, but more importantly, it was served with the warmth and care that had made Margaret's business special. Every employee was there, not as hired help, but as family members saying goodbye to someone they had loved and respected. Bradley made a brief appearance at the reception, shaking hands with a few business associates and accepting condolences with practiced politeness, but I could see him glancing at his watch constantly, and he made no effort to speak with Margaret's employees or thank them for their years of service to his mother. After about 20 minutes, he approached me with barely concealed impatience. "Dad, this is taking forever," he said quietly. trying to keep his voice low enough that nearby mourners couldn't hear him. "How much longer do we have to stay? I've got that conference call at 4, and I need to review some documents before then." I stared at my son, struggling to understand how he could be thinking about business calls while surrounded by people who were genuinely grieving his mother's death. "Bradley, these people loved your mother," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my growing anger. "They took time off work to be here. Some of them drove hours to pay their respects. The least we can do is be present for them." He rolled his eyes with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Dad, I appreciate what Mom meant to these people, but standing around making small talk isn't going to bring her back. We have practical matters to deal with, legal stuff that can't wait indefinitely." His dismissive tone carried clearly enough that Dorothy Chen, standing nearby, turned to look at us with an expression of shock and disapproval. Before I could respond, Bradley glanced around the fellowship hall and made the comment that would define this day in my memory forever. "Honestly, Dad, this whole thing has been incredibly boring. The service went on way too long, all those speeches were repetitive, and now we're stuck here eating church food and pretending to care about these people's stories. Can we just wrap this up and get to the lawyer's office? That's where the real business gets handled." The words hung in the air like a slap. Several people within earshot stopped their conversations and turned to stare at Bradley with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright anger. Dorothy Chen set down her coffee cup with such force that it rattled against the saucer. Tom Rodriguez, who had been speaking quietly with other kitchen staff members, looked up with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of hurt and fury that made me want to apologize on my son's behalf. "Bradley Thompson," Dorothy said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet fellowship hall, "your mother spent 40 years building something beautiful in this community. She employed my family, supported my children, and treated everyone she met with dignity and respect. This boring funeral you're complaining about is a celebration of a life that mattered to hundreds of people. Show some respect or leave." The entire reception had gone silent now. Every conversation stopped as people processed what they had just witnessed. Bradley's face flushed red as he realized that his private complaint had become a public embarrassment. But instead of apologizing or showing any recognition of how hurtful his words had been, he doubled down with the arrogance that had become his trademark response to criticism. "Look, I understand everyone loved my mother, and I'm grateful for that," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being generous to lesser people. "But let's be realistic here. She ran a small-town catering business, not a charity. This isn't a memorial for Mother Teresa. We've spent 3 hours listening to people talk about casseroles and community service. Some of us have actual businesses to run, real responsibilities that can't be put on hold indefinitely." The fellowship hall erupted in a buzz of angry whispers and shocked exclamations. I watched Tom Rodriguez walk toward the kitchen area, his shoulders rigid with suppressed anger. Several elderly church members gathered near the coffee table, their faces reflecting the kind of outrage that comes from witnessing something truly offensive. Dorothy Chen approached Bradley directly, her small frame somehow seeming larger as she confronted him. "Your mother's small-town catering business employed 53 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue," she said, her voice steady but ice-cold. Her charity work included a scholarship fund that sent 47 local students to college, a meal program that fed hungry families during the recession, and disaster relief efforts that helped our neighbors when the floods hit 3 years ago. If you think that kind of impact is boring, then you understand nothing about what success actually means. Bradley stared at Dorothy with surprise, apparently shocked that someone he considered a mere employee would dare to confront him so directly. For a moment, I thought he might actually apologize or at least acknowledge the validity of her points. Instead, he shrugged with the casual dismissal of someone who had never learned that other people's opinions might matter. "That's all very nice, but it doesn't change the fact that we have legal business to handle this afternoon. Dad, are you ready to go, or do you want to stay here all day listening to more stories about Mom's community service projects?" I looked around the fellowship hall at the faces of people who had genuinely loved Margaret, people whose lives had been enriched by her generosity and kindness. These were the individuals who had built their own successes on the foundation of dignity and mutual support that Margaret had helped create in Cedar Falls. They deserved better than the contempt my son was showing them, and Margaret deserved better than to have her funeral dismissed as a boring inconvenience. "Actually, Bradley," I said, my voice carrying more authority than I had used with him in years, "I think we should stay until the last person leaves.
These people came here to honor your mother's memory, and the least we can do is honor them in return." Bradley's eyebrows shot up in surprise, apparently unused to any resistance from me.
"Dad, that's ridiculous. We'll be here for another hour at least, and Robert Chen is expecting us at his office at 3:30. We can't keep the lawyer waiting because you want to socialize with Mom's employees." The way he said employees made it sound like a distasteful word, as if the people who had worked alongside Margaret for decades were somehow beneath his consideration. "Then you go ahead to the lawyer's office," I replied, surprised by my own decisiveness. "I'll meet you there when I'm finished saying goodbye to people who actually cared about your mother." Bradley stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether this was worth the public confrontation. Finally, he shook his head with the exaggerated disappointment of someone dealing with an unreasonable family member. "Fine, Dad, stay here as long as you want, but don't blame me when we're late for the will reading and the lawyer has to reschedule everything because you wanted to extend the social hour." He gathered his coat and briefcase with sharp, angry movements that announced his displeasure to everyone in the fellowship hall. As Bradley headed toward the exit, Dorothy Chen touched my arm gently. "Frank, your wife would be proud of you for standing up to him like that. She always said you were a good man who just needed to remember his own strength." Her words carried more comfort than anything I had heard during the long, difficult weeks since Margaret's death. Bradley paused at the fellowship hall doorway and called back across the room, his voice carrying the kind of authority he used in business negotiations. "Dad, I'll see you at Robert Chen's office in 1 hour. Try not to be late for the only part of today that actually matters." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed something that would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years to come. What Bradley didn't know, as he drove away from Harmony Methodist Church, was that his behavior at his mother's funeral had been observed not just by Margaret's employees and friends, but by someone whose opinion would matter far more than he could have imagined. Someone who had been taking very careful notes about the kind of man Bradley had become and the kind of respect he showed for the values that had built the life he expected to inherit. The drive to Robert Chen's law office took me through neighborhoods that held 45 years of memories. Past the elementary school where I had worked for 4 decades, keeping the hallways clean and the boiler running while teachers shaped young minds. Past the small house on Elm Street where Margaret and I had lived as newlyweds, dreaming of the family we would build together. Past the library where we had taken Bradley every Saturday when he was young, before he decided that books were less interesting than business magazines and real estate journals. I had met Margaret Thompson in the most ordinary way imaginable, which somehow made our love story feel more precious rather than less. It was September 1978, and I was 23 years old, fresh out of my apprenticeship with the school district's maintenance department and proud of my promotion to head custodian at Cedar Falls Elementary. The job came with responsibilities that extended far beyond mopping floors and emptying trash cans. I was the person who arrived first each morning to ensure the building was warm and welcoming for 600 children and their teachers. I was the one who stayed late to lock up after evening events, making sure every classroom was secure and ready for the next day's learning. Margaret had been hired as the new 3rd grade teacher that fall, replacing Mrs. Henderson, who had retired after 30 years of service. She was 21 years old, recently graduated from the University of Northern Iowa with a degree in elementary education and a fierce determination to make a difference in children's lives.
Her classroom was on the 2nd floor, room 204, and she had spent the entire week before school started rearranging desks, hanging colorful bulletin boards, and creating reading corners that would make her students excited about learning. I first noticed her on a Thursday evening in late August when I was doing my final security check before locking up the building. Most teachers had gone home hours earlier, but light was still streaming from under the door of room 204. I knocked gently, expecting to find someone who had simply forgotten to turn off the lights.
Instead, I discovered Margaret sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by children's books, meticulously organizing her classroom library by reading level and subject matter. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, looking up from her piles of books with genuine concern. "Am I keeping you from going home? I know it's late, but I wanted to get these organized before the children arrive on Monday." Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her simple dress was wrinkled from sitting on the floor for hours. She wore no makeup, needed none, and her eyes held the kind of earnest enthusiasm that made me believe she could indeed change the world, one 8-year-old at a time. "No problem at all," I replied, stepping into her classroom and marveling at the transformation she had accomplished. Where Mrs. Henderson had maintained neat rows of desks facing forward toward the blackboard, Margaret had created clusters of learning spaces that encouraged collaboration and movement. "This looks amazing. The kids are going to love it." She smiled with the genuine pleasure of someone who had found her calling early in life. "I hope so. I want them to feel like this classroom belongs to them, like it's a place where they can explore and discover and make mistakes without being afraid." She gestured toward a corner where she had arranged cushions and a small bookshelf to create an informal reading area. "I know some people think structure is more important than comfort, but I believe children learn better when they feel safe and welcomed." I helped her organize the remaining books, impressed by how thoughtfully she had considered each child's needs, even though she hadn't met them yet. She had books for advanced readers and picture books for those still struggling with basic skills. She had stories that reflected different cultures and family structures, making sure every child in her classroom would see themselves represented in her library. When we finished, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and I offered to walk her to her car in the empty parking lot. "I'm Frank Thompson, by the way," I said, as we stepped into the warm August evening. "Head custodian and unofficial building manager. If you need anything, supplies, furniture moved, or just someone to unlock a door you've accidentally locked yourself out of, I'm your guy." She laughed, a sound that seemed to make the evening air lighter. "Margaret Collins," she replied, extending her hand with a firm shake that suggested strength and confidence despite her small stature. "And I have a feeling I'm going to need that door unlocking service more often than I'd like to admit. I tend to get absorbed in my work and forget practical things like keys and time." It was the beginning of a friendship that would gradually transform into something deeper. Over the following months, I found excuses to check on Margaret's classroom more frequently than strictly necessary. If she was staying late to prepare lessons or grade papers, I would offer to help with tasks that required reaching high shelves or moving heavy furniture. She would share stories about her students' progress and challenges, and I would tell her about the teachers I had worked with over the years, the ones who had made lasting differences in children's lives, and the qualities they all seemed to share. Margaret possessed all of those qualities in abundance. She noticed when quiet children needed encouragement to participate in class discussions. She created special projects for advanced students who finished their regular work quickly. She communicated with parents not just about problems, but about their children's strengths and achievements. Most importantly, she approached teaching as a sacred responsibility, understanding that the way she treated each child would shape their relationship with learning for years to come. By December, our conversations had evolved beyond school-related topics. She told me about growing up on a farm outside Cedar Falls, the youngest of 5 children, whose parents had taught her that hard work and compassion were the most important values a person could possess. I shared stories about my own childhood, raised by a single mother who had worked 2 jobs to support us after my father died in a construction accident. We discovered a shared appreciation for simple pleasures, good books, homemade food, long walks through the countryside that surrounded our small town. The moment I knew I was falling in love with Margaret came on a snowy Friday evening in February. She had volunteered to stay after school to help with the annual winter carnival, decorating the gymnasium and setting up game booths that would entertain children and families the following day. Most of the other volunteers had left by 7 o'clock, but Margaret remained, determined to make sure every detail was perfect for the children who would attend. I was supposed to leave at 6, but I had stayed to help with the heavier decorating task, watching Margaret transform the plain gymnasium into a winter wonderland with paper snowflakes, twinkling lights, and handmade signs that welcome families to celebrate together. When we finally finished, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and the snow that had been falling lightly all day had become a serious storm that made driving dangerous. "You shouldn't drive home in this weather," I told her, watching the wind whip snow across the empty parking lot. "The roads are getting bad and visibility is terrible. Why don't I give you a ride and we can come back for your car tomorrow when the storm passes?" She accepted gratefully, and we spent the 20-minute drive to her apartment talking about everything except the obvious attraction that had been building between us for months. When we arrived at her building, she invited me in for coffee, ostensibly to wait until the storm subsided enough for me to drive safely home. We sat in her small living room, drinking instant coffee and talking about our dreams for the future, our hopes for the children we worked with, and the kind of life we each wanted to build. Somewhere around midnight, as the storm continued to rage outside, Margaret reached across the space between us on her couch and took my hand. "Frank," she said quietly, a voice carrying a combination of nervousness and determination, "I need to tell you something. I've been hoping for months that you might ask me out, but you're so respectful and professional that I'm starting to think you might not realize how much I enjoy spending time with you." Her honesty was typical of Margaret's approach to life, direct, genuine, and brave in ways that made my heart race. "I've been wanting to ask you out since September," I replied, amazed by my own courage. "But I wasn't sure if it was appropriate, dating someone I work with. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable or complicate your job if things didn't work out between us." She squeezed my hand gently, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that I was feeling. "Life is too short to worry about what might go wrong," she said, leaning closer until I could smell the subtle perfume she wore and see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Why don't we focus on what might go right instead?" I kissed her then, a gentle kiss that tasted like coffee and possibility and felt like the beginning of everything I had been hoping for without knowing how to name it. Our courtship unfolded with the steady rhythm of two people who had found their match in each other. We attended county fairs and church picnics, took long drives through the Iowa countryside, and discovered that we shared not only interests and values, but a vision of what a good life should include. Margaret wanted to make a difference in the world through teaching and community service. I wanted to support that mission while contributing my own skills to maintaining the places where learning and growth could happen. We were married in June 1980 in a simple ceremony at Harmony Methodist Church that was attended by our families, our co-workers, and many of the students whose lives Margaret had already begun to touch.
She wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that we had picked together from the meadow behind her childhood home. I wore my father's suit, carefully preserved by my mother for special occasions, and felt like the luckiest man in Iowa as I promised to love and honor this remarkable woman for the rest of my life. Our early years of marriage were marked by the kind of contentment that comes from building something meaningful together. Margaret continued teaching while I expanded my responsibilities at the school district, eventually becoming the head of maintenance for all the elementary schools in Cedar Falls. We bought the little house on Elm Street, painted the rooms in cheerful colors, and planted a garden that provided vegetables for our table and flowers for Margaret's classroom. Bradley arrived in 1983, a healthy baby who completed our family in ways we hadn't even realized we were missing. Margaret took maternity leave for the remainder of the school year, then made the difficult decision to resign from teaching to focus on raising our son. It wasn't a choice she made lightly, but she believed that the early years of a child's life were too important to leave to others, and we both agreed that one parent should be home full-time during Bradley's formative years. The transition from 2 incomes to 1 required careful budgeting and some sacrifices, but Margaret approached the challenge with the same determination she brought to everything else. She became an expert at stretching grocery budgets, finding bargains at thrift stores, and creating enriching experiences for Bradley that cost little money but provided immense value. She organized playgroups with other stay-at-home mothers, took Bradley on nature walks that doubled his science lessons, and read to him for hours each day, instilling a love of stories and learning that we hoped would serve him throughout his life. It was during those years of Bradley's early childhood that Margaret first began cooking for other families. It started as a favor for her friend Susan Miller, who had just given birth to twins and was overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 2 infants while recovering from a difficult delivery. Margaret prepared a week's worth of meals, carefully packaged and labeled, that Susan could simply reheat when her family was hungry. Word spread quickly through our circle of friends and neighbors about Margaret's cooking skills and her willingness to help families during challenging times. Soon, she was regularly preparing meals for new mothers, elderly neighbors, and families dealing with illness or other crises. She never charged for these services, considering them acts of Christian charity and community support, but people began insisting on paying her for ingredients and time. By the time Bradley started kindergarten, Margaret had developed a regular clientele of families who relied on her home-cooked meals to supplement their busy lives. She was providing dinner for the Patterson family twice a week when Mrs. Patterson was undergoing chemotherapy. She prepared Sunday dinner for the elderly Hendersons, who could no longer manage the physical demands of cooking elaborate meals for their large family gatherings. She created special birthday cakes and holiday treats for neighbors who wanted homemade quality but lacked the time or skills to bake from scratch. What had begun as neighborly kindness was gradually evolving into something that resembled the business, though Margaret resisted thinking of it in those terms.
She was simply doing what came naturally to her, nurturing people through food, supporting her community through practical service, and using her considerable skills to meet needs that she noticed around her. The money she earned was modest but meaningful, providing a sense of independence and contribution that complemented her role as wife and mother. Bradley thrived in this environment of warmth, industry, and community connection. He spent his after-school hours in the kitchen with Margaret, learning to measure ingredients, fold napkins, and understand that food was an expression of love for the people who shared it. He accompanied her on deliveries, meeting the families she served and observing firsthand how his mother's work made their lives easier and more pleasant. Those were the years when Bradley seemed to understand and appreciate the values that guided our family. He was proud of his mother's reputation as the best cook in Cedar Falls. He enjoyed helping with simple tasks that made him feel like a contributor to something important. He understood that work was valuable not just because it provided money, but because it served others and strengthened the community bonds that made life richer and more meaningful for everyone. Robert Chen's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian mansion on 3rd Street, the kind of building that spoke of old money and established respectability. I arrived 15 minutes early, still shaken by the confrontation at the church reception, and found myself sitting in a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. The waiting room was furnished with antique pieces and original oil paintings that suggested Robert's practice catered to Cedar Falls' most successful families and businesses. Bradley was already there when I walked in, pacing near the tall windows that overlooked the town square. He had changed out of his funeral suit into a more casual outfit that still managed to look expensive, dark slacks and a sweater that probably came from some boutique in Des Moines. His earlier irritation had been replaced by an energy that I recognized from his childhood, the restless excitement he used to display on Christmas morning when he was anticipating presents. "Finally," he said when he saw me enter the waiting room, "I was starting to think you'd decided to spend the entire afternoon at that reception." His tone carried a hint of apology, perhaps recognizing that his behavior at the church had been inappropriate, but not enough remorse to actually acknowledge his mistakes. "Robert's been waiting for us. Apparently Mom's will is more complicated than usual, which probably means she's set up some kind of trust fund or tax shelter arrangement." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner, escorted us into Robert's private office. The room was impressive in the way that successful lawyers' offices always are, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a mahogany desk that could have served as a dining table for 6 people, and windows that provided a commanding view of downtown Cedar Falls. Robert Chen himself was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades handling the legal affairs of wealthy families. "Frank, Bradley, please accept my deepest condolences," Robert said, rising from behind his desk to shake our hands with the practiced sympathy of someone who had guided countless families through the legal aftermath of loss. Margaret was not only a valued client, but someone I considered a friend. Her death is a tremendous loss for our entire community.
He gestured toward 2 chairs positioned in front of his desk, and we settled ourselves for what I assumed would be a straightforward reading of a will that would leave everything to Bradley. Robert opened a thick file folder and extracted several legal documents, adjusting his reading glasses as he prepared to begin the formal proceedings. Before we start, I want to explain that Margaret was very specific about how she wanted this will reading to be conducted. She left detailed instructions about the order in which information should be shared, and she asked me to read certain sections verbatim rather than simply summarizing the contents. Bradley leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together in the posture of someone preparing to receive good news. That sounds like Mom, always organizing everything down to the smallest detail. She probably wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings about her wishes. He glanced at me with what might have been sympathy or condescension. I'm sure she made some provision for Dad, maybe enough to help with his living expenses or medical bills as he gets older. Actually, Robert said, his tone becoming more formal as he lifted the first document, Margaret's will contains several surprises that I think will astonish both of you. She spent considerable time over the past year reviewing and revising these documents, consulting with financial advisors, and ensuring that her final wishes would be legally unassailable. Something in his voice made my stomach tighten with a premonition that this reading would not unfold as any of us expected. The last will and testament of Margaret Collins Thompson, executed on January 15th of this year and properly witnessed according to Iowa state law, Robert began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of legal formality. I, Margaret Collins Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils and declare this to be my final testament regarding the disposition of my assets and property. Bradley nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that the document was recent and legally sound. I found myself wondering why Margaret had updated her will so recently, and what had prompted her to make changes just months before her death. Had she been feeling unwell? Had something happened that made her contemplate mortality more seriously than usual? To my beloved husband, Frank Thompson, Robert continued reading, I leave the family home at 412 Maple Avenue, along with all furnishings, personal property, and household items contained therein. I felt a flicker of surprise at this bequest. The house on Maple Avenue was where we had lived during the peak years of Margaret's business success, a substantial property worth at least $300,000. I had assumed that Bradley would inherit the family home, since I was comfortably settled in my apartment at Riverside Gardens. Bradley's eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't seem overly concerned by this inheritance. That's generous of Mom, he said. Those tones suggested he was merely being polite about what he considered a minor bequest. The house has sentimental value, and Dad will probably be more comfortable there than in that senior complex. He was already thinking past this relatively small inheritance to the larger prizes that he assumed were coming his way. Additionally, Robert continued, I bequeath to Frank the sum of $50,000 from my personal savings account, to be used for home maintenance, living expenses, or any other purposes he deems appropriate. This was a more substantial gift than I had expected, enough money to live comfortably for several years or to handle any major repairs that the old house might need. Bradley shifted slightly in his chair, perhaps calculating that between the house and the cash, I was receiving close to $400,000 in total value. That's very thoughtful, Bradley said, and I could hear him trying to keep any hint of impatience out of his voice. I'm always worried about Dad having enough money for retirement. This should take care of any financial concerns he might have. He was being gracious about my inheritance, secure in his expectation that the real wealth would be flowing in his direction. Robert set down the first page of the will and lifted the second, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite what I was beginning to suspect were bombshell revelations yet to come.
To my son, Bradley Michael Thompson, he read, I leave my personal jewelry, family photographs, and other items of sentimental value, along with the sum of $25,000 from my investment portfolio. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Bradley's face went completely white,
then flushed red as if his circulatory system couldn't decide which direction blood should flow. $25,000. Not $25 million, not the controlling interest in Maggie's kitchen, not the business empire he had been expecting to inherit. Just $25,000 and some family mementos? "I'm sorry," Bradley said, his voice cracking slightly. "Could you repeat that? I think I misheard something." Robert removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that seemed designed to give everyone a moment to process what they had just learned. $25,000 and personal items of sentimental value, Robert repeated clearly. Those are the specific bequests to you outlined in your mother's will. Bradley stared at the lawyer with an expression of complete disbelief, as if Robert had just announced that gravity had stopped working or that the sun had decided to rise in the west. "That can't be right," Bradley said, his voice rising with each word. "There has to be some mistake in the documentation. Mom's business is worth millions of dollars. Her investment portfolio, her real estate holdings, the equipment and inventory at Maggie's kitchen. Where is all of that going?" His hands were shaking now, his entire body vibrating with shock and growing panic. Robert consulted the will again, turning to the third page with deliberate care. The remaining assets of Margaret's estate, including Maggie's kitchen and all associated business properties, equipment, and accounts, along with her investment portfolio, valued at approximately $1.8 million, are bequeathed in their entirety to Frank Thompson. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent office, bouncing off the walls and bookcases like stones thrown into a still pond. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways as Robert's words penetrated my consciousness. $1.8 million plus the business. Maggie's kitchen, the company that Margaret had built from nothing, the empire that employed dozens of people and served customers throughout 3 counties. She was giving it all to me, a retired school custodian who had never run so much as a lemonade stand. "This is impossible," Bradley whispered, his voice barely audible. Then louder, with growing hysteria. "This is absolutely impossible. She wouldn't do this. She couldn't do this. There has to be fraud involved, or mental incompetence, or some kind of coercion." He turned to stare at me with wild eyes, as if Robert had just announced that gravity had stopped working, or that the sun had decided to rise in the west. "This can't be right," Bradley said, his voice rising with each word. There has to be some mistake in the documentation. Mom's business is worth millions of dollars. Her investment portfolio, her real estate holdings, the equipment and inventory at Maggie's kitchen. Where is all of that going?" His hands were shaking now, his entire body vibrating with shock and growing panic. Robert consulted the will again, turning to the third page with deliberate care. The remaining assets of Margaret's estate, including Maggie's kitchen and all associated business properties, equipment, and accounts, along with her investment portfolio, valued at approximately $1.8 million, are bequeathed in their entirety to Frank Thompson. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent office, bouncing off the walls and bookcases like stones thrown into a still pond. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways as Robert's words penetrated my consciousness. $1.8 million plus the business. Maggie's kitchen, the company that Margaret had built from nothing, the empire that employed dozens of people and served customers throughout 3 counties. She was giving it all to me, a retired school custodian who had never run so much as a lemonade stand.
Bradley's voice cracked like a teenager's, all his adult sophistication stripped away by the devastating realization that his expectations had been completely shattered. "Why would she do this to me? I'm her son. I worked for her company. I was everything she wanted me to be. I built my entire life around the assumption that I would inherit what she created." Robert opened another envelope, this one sealed and marked with Margaret's handwriting. "Your mother anticipated that you would have questions about her decision. She left a personal letter explaining her reasoning, with instructions that it should be read after the will had been announced. He extracted several pages of cream-colored stationery covered with Margaret's distinctive script. "A letter," Bradley said bitterly. "She couldn't explain this to my face, but she left me a letter? What does it say? What possible justification could there be for giving everything to him instead of me?" He pointed at me with a shaking finger, his entire worldview crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Robert cleared his throat and began reading in Margaret's own words. "My dearest Bradley, if you're hearing this letter, it means I'm gone, and you're probably angrier than you've ever been in your life. You're sitting in Robert's office wondering how your mother could betray you so completely, how she could give away everything you expected to inherit to the father you've spent years dismissing as irrelevant." The accuracy of Margaret's prediction was almost frightening. She had known exactly how Bradley would react, had anticipated his rage and sense of betrayal with the precision of someone who understood her son's character completely. Robert continued reading as Bradley stood frozen near the window, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. "But, sweetheart, this isn't a betrayal. This is the most loving thing I could do for you, though you won't understand that for many years to come. You see, Bradley, I've been watching you for the past 15 years, watching you become someone I barely recognize. The little boy who used to help me in the kitchen, who understood that work was about serving others, has grown into a man who measures success only in dollars and who treats people as obstacles to his own advancement." Bradley made a sound like a wounded animal, but Robert continued reading without pause. "You called my funeral boring, Bradley. You dismissed the testimonies of people whose lives I touched as repetitive and meaningless. You showed no respect for the employees who built this business alongside me, no gratitude for the community that supported our family, no understanding of what actually matters in life." "She was watching," Bradley whispered, his voice hollow with realization. "Someone told her what I said at the reception." He turned to look at me with an expression that mixed blame with dawning comprehension. "You told her, didn't you? You reported back to her about everything I said and did." "No," Robert said firmly. "Your mother made her final decision about the will 3 months ago, long before today's funeral. But she did ask several trusted friends to observe your behavior today to confirm that her assessment of your character was accurate. Their reports simply validated what she already knew about the man you had become." The letter continued for several more paragraphs, detailing Margaret's hopes that inheriting less money might force Bradley to develop the character and empathy that unlimited wealth had prevented him from acquiring. She explained her confidence that I would use her business and fortune to continue the mission of community service that had always motivated her work. Most painfully for Bradley, she expressed her love for him while clearly stating that love sometimes meant making difficult decisions that served a person's long-term growth rather than their immediate desires. When Robert finished reading, the office fell into profound silence. Bradley remained standing by the window, staring out at the town square where his mother had built her reputation through decades of generous service. I sat in my chair, overwhelmed by the responsibility Margaret had placed on my shoulders, and by the painful recognition that our son had become someone neither of us had ever intended to raise. "This isn't over," Bradley said finally, his voice quiet, but filled with cold determination. "I'm going to challenge this will. Mental incompetence, undue influence, fraud. Whatever it takes. No court in the world will uphold a decision this irrational." He gathered his coat and briefcase with sharp, angry movements that announced his intention to fight this decision with every resource at his disposal. "You're certainly free to try," Robert replied calmly, "but I should warn you that your mother anticipated that possibility as well. She spent considerable money ensuring that this will is legally bulletproof. Any challenge you mount will be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful." Bradley paused at the office door, turning back to deliver one final accusation. "You orchestrated this somehow," he said, pointing at me with barely controlled fury. "I don't know how, but you convinced her to do this. You manipulated a sick old woman into giving you everything that should have been mine." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room that seemed to echo with the violence of his departure. I remained in my chair for several minutes after Bradley left, trying to process the enormity of what had just occurred.
Robert gathered the legal documents into neat stacks, his movements careful and deliberate as he prepared to transfer ownership of Margaret's life work into my completely unprepared hands. "She really loved you, Frank," he said quietly. "Every time we met to discuss the will, she talked about the man who had taught her that character mattered more than success, that service to others was the highest calling any person could pursue. She believed you were the only person she could trust to continue her legacy in the way she intended." Outside Robert's office window, the afternoon sun was setting over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the town square where Margaret had spent 43 years building something beautiful and meaningful. I was no longer just Frank Thompson, retired school custodian and widowed husband. I was now the owner of a business empire and the guardian of a legacy that would require every ounce of wisdom and strength I possessed to preserve and continue. The boy who had dismissed his mother's funeral as boring would soon discover that some lessons can only be learned through loss, and that the true measure of a person's worth is revealed not in what they expect to receive, but in how they respond when their expectations are shattered completely. The weeks following the will reading passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings with accountants, and phone calls from employees who needed reassurance that Maggie's kitchen would continue operating despite Margaret's death. I found myself thrust into a world I had never imagined entering, surrounded by business documents I barely understood, and making decisions that affected the livelihoods of 53 people who had trusted Margaret to provide stable employment. Dorothy Chen became my lifeline during those overwhelming first days. She arrived at my apartment on the Saturday morning after the funeral, carrying a thick folder of operational documents and wearing the expression of someone prepared to work as long as necessary to ensure continuity. "Frank, I know this is all new to you," she said, settling at my small kitchen table with the patience of someone who had spent decades teaching complicated processes to confused people. But Margaret prepared for this possibility. She left detailed instructions about how the business should be managed if something happened to her. The instructions were vintage Margaret, thorough and thoughtful, covering everything from daily operations to long-term strategic planning. She had identified key employees who could handle specific responsibilities, outlined procedures for maintaining quality standards, and even included suggestions for how I might gradually learn the business without disrupting established routines.
Most importantly, she had written detailed explanations of the company's mission and values, ensuring that anyone who inherited her work would understand what really mattered about Maggie's kitchen. "She talked about you constantly during those final months," Dorothy confided as we reviewed supplier contracts and employee schedules. "She said you were the only person who truly understood what she was trying to build, the only one who would preserve the heart of what made this business special." Dorothy's confidence in Margaret's judgment gave me strength during moments when the responsibility felt overwhelming. The transition wasn't without challenges. 2 employees quit during the first week, apparently unwilling to work for someone they considered unqualified to lead the company. Several longtime customers called to express concern about potential changes to Margaret's recipes or service standards. A few suppliers demanded meetings to assess whether I could maintain the payment schedules and quality requirements that Margaret had established. But for every person who doubted my ability to continue Margaret's work, 3 others stepped forward to offer support and encouragement. Tom Rodriguez, the head chef, spent hours teaching me about food preparation standards and kitchen management. Sarah Williams, the catering coordinator, patiently explained client relationships and event planning procedures. Even customers began stopping by the kitchen to introduce themselves and share stories about what Margaret's service had meant to their families. The most difficult aspect of inheriting Margaret's business wasn't learning operational procedures or financial management. It was discovering the full extent of her quiet generosity and figuring out how to continue programs that had never been officially documented. Margaret had been providing free meals to elderly residents who could no longer afford proper nutrition. She had been donating catering services to non-profit fundraising events. She had been employing people with disabilities and criminal records who couldn't find work elsewhere. These acts of charity had been funded personally by Margaret, hidden within the company's expenses, or simply absorbed as part of her private giving.
Now I faced the choice of continuing these programs, potentially reducing the business's profitability, or ending services that had become lifelines for vulnerable community members. The decision wasn't difficult once I understood what Margaret would have wanted, but it required careful financial planning to ensure the business remained sustainable while maintaining its charitable mission. Bradley's challenge to the will provided a constant source of stress during those first months. His lawyer filed motions questioning Margaret's mental competency, demanding investigations into possible fraud, and requesting detailed financial audits of the estate. Each legal document that arrived in my mailbox represented another attempt to prove that I had somehow manipulated Margaret into making decisions that defied logic and fairness. The legal battle dragged on for 6 months, during which Bradley and I didn't speak directly. Our only communication came through lawyers and court documents, creating a formal hostility that was somehow worse than open confrontation. I learned through Robert Chen that Bradley had hired private investigators to examine my relationship with Margaret, hoping to find evidence of inappropriate influence or hidden contact that might invalidate the will. The investigators found nothing because there was nothing to find. Margaret had made her decision independently based on years of observing both her son's character and my own.
The psychiatric evaluations confirmed her mental competency at the time she executed the will. The financial audits revealed no irregularities or suspicious transactions. One by one, Bradley's legal arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence that his mother had simply chosen to reward character over entitlement. The final court hearing took place on a cold February morning that reminded me of the day I had first met Margaret at the elementary school 45 years earlier. Bradley sat with his legal team on one side of the courtroom while I occupied a single chair with Robert Chen beside me. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had known Margaret personally through various community organizations, listened patiently to final arguments from both sides before delivering her ruling. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates conclusively that Margaret Thompson was mentally competent when she executed her final will and testament, Judge Anderson stated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades weighing evidence and rendering decisions. The disposition of her assets reflects her personal values and her assessment of the beneficiary's characters. While the court recognizes that Mr. Bradley Thompson may feel disappointed by his mother's choices, disappointment does not constitute grounds for overturning a legally valid document. Bradley's shoulders sagged as the judge's words ended his last hope of recovering what he had expected to inherit. He looked older than his 35 years, worn down by months of legal battles and the devastating realization that his mother had deliberately chosen to disinherit him. When the hearing ended, he walked past me without acknowledgement, a defeated man whose entire understanding of his place in the world had been permanently shattered. I felt no triumph in watching my son's final defeat. Margaret's decision had been about teaching lessons and preserving values, not about punishing Bradley for his failures of character. But those lessons could only be learned if Bradley chose to examine his own behavior and values, and there was no indication that he was prepared for such painful self-reflection. The legal victory freed me to focus completely on learning Margaret's business and continuing her mission of community service. Over the following year, I gradually developed the skills necessary to manage operations while preserving the personal touch that had made Maggie's Kitchen special. I learned to read financial statements, negotiate supplier contracts, and make the difficult decisions that came with employing dozens of people in a competitive industry. More importantly, I discovered that Margaret had been right about my ability to understand what really mattered about her work. The business wasn't about maximizing profits or building an empire. It was about nourishing people, supporting community connections, and using success as a tool for serving others rather than elevating ourselves. These were values I had learned during my years as a school custodian, where the measure of success was whether children had clean, safe spaces where they could learn and grow. By the second anniversary of Margaret's death, Maggie's Kitchen was thriving under my stewardship. We had expanded our charitable programs, improved employee benefits, and maintained the quality standards that had built Margaret's reputation. The business was profitable enough to support all our community services while providing good wages for our workers and reasonable returns for reinvestment and growth. Bradley never contacted me after the court ruling, but I heard occasional reports about his life through mutual acquaintances. He had suffered significant financial losses during the legal battle, depleting his savings on attorney fees and court costs. His real estate development business struggled without the capital injection he had expected from Margaret's estate. Most painfully, for a man who had always defined himself through material success, he was forced to downsize his lifestyle and acknowledge that his mother's inheritance would not rescue him from the consequences of his own choices.
3 years after Margaret's funeral, I received an unexpected visitor at the Maggie's kitchen offices. Bradley stood in my doorway looking humbler than I had seen him since childhood, his expensive clothes replaced by simple slacks and a plain shirt that suggested reduced circumstances. He had requested the meeting through Dorothy Chen, apparently unwilling to call me directly, but needing to have a conversation that was long overdue. "Dad," he said quietly, taking the chair across from my desk with none of his former arrogance, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. For the things I said at Mom's funeral, for the legal challenges, for years of treating you like your life didn't matter." His voice carried a weight of regret that suggested genuine remorse rather than strategic manipulation. "I've spent 3 years trying to understand why Mom made the choices she did," he continued, his eyes focused on his hands rather than my face. "Why she trusted you with everything she had built while leaving me with almost nothing. I thought it was about the money, about her favoring you over me for some reason I couldn't understand." He looked up finally, and I saw pain in his expression that reminded me of the confused little boy he had once been. "But it wasn't about money at all, was it? It was about character, about the kind of person Mom believed you were versus the kind of person I had become." The admission seemed to cost him significant effort, but he continued with growing conviction. "She was right, Dad. I had turned into someone who measured everything by profit margins and personal advancement. Someone who forgot that work should serve others, not just enrich ourselves." We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, the first honest conversation we had shared since he was a teenager. Bradley told me about the lessons he had learned through losing his expected inheritance, about the humility that came from having to rebuild his life without the safety net he had always assumed would be there. He spoke about wanting to earn his way back into the family business, not as an heir claiming his birthright, but as an employee willing to learn from the ground up. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said as our meeting drew to a close. "I don't expect you to trust me or give me opportunities I haven't earned, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Mom was trying to teach me, and I wanted to ask if there might be a place for me somewhere in what she built, even if it's just washing dishes or cleaning floors." Margaret would have been proud of the man her son was becoming, even if the transformation had required more pain than any parent would wish on their child. Justice, I realized, wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating circumstances where people could discover their better selves and choose to become worthy of the love they had been offered all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.